Okay, Chem 1110 students, now we're going to talk about the second part of ionic and covalent compounds, chapter 5. And so this is going to be a discussion of the covalent compounds. In 1A, we talked about ionic. So, all right, so in a compound formed between two elements that have similar properties, in other words, not a metal and a nonmetal, but say two nonmetals, the electron is not transferred from one element to the other, but instead the electrons are shared so that each atom feels as though it has a noble gas configuration. This is the Lewis theory of bonding. Same Lewis, it gave us Lewis dot structures. And so for H2, which is hydrogen gas, it is something that is in our air. We can produce hydrogen gas from water. It's very common. We have two hydrogen atoms that each have one electron in the 1s orbital. And so if they share those, then each hydrogen sees two electrons in the 1s orbital, which would be a 1s2, and it would be a filled shell like helium. So the electrons are not transferred, but they are shared equally, and they both believe that they have achieved an isoelectronic nature with a noble gas. And so this sharing of electrons is known as covalent bonding, and the shared pair of electrons, make up a covalent bond. So a molecule is a combination of at least two atoms in some sort of specific arrangement held together by chemical bonds. A molecule can be made up of just one element, or it can be a compound, meaning it's made up of different kinds of elements. But no matter where you find a specimen of a particular compound, it's always going to have the same ratio. So water, for instance, water taken out of the Tennessee River is H2O, just like the water taken out of the Pacific Ocean. And this is known as the law of definite proportions. Things are put together in a proportion that makes them stable, and they stay like that. An example here is carbon dioxide. 3 different samples of carbon dioxide, presumably taken from different places, and the ratio in grams of oxygen to carbon is always 2.66 to 1. Well, it just so happens that sometimes those elements can make more than one compound, but the ratios of, say, for instance, the carbon to the oxygen is still going to be fixed. It's always going to be the same. And it says that those can be expressed as small whole numbers. So that's the law of multiple proportions. And here's an example. So carbon and oxygen can combine to form both carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide. Here's some data for carbon monoxide, and you see the grams of oxygen to the grams of carbon are 1.33 to 1. So half as much oxygen as we saw in the carbon dioxide, which we would expect from the name. And so we're going to look for that simple whole number or integral ratio. And so if we just divide those, the mass of oxygen in carbon dioxide to the mass ratio of oxygen to carbon in carbon monoxide, you have 2.66 divided by 1.33, so it's a 2 to 1. And the picture can look like this. Carbon dioxide has 2 carbons with 1 oxygen in the middle, so that's a 2 to 1 ratio. Carbon monoxide is a 1 to 1. So basically what this is saying is 2 different elements can produce more than one kind of compound, but it's always going to be to a specific ratio because you can't have just part of an atom involved. Okay, so we need to recognize there's some different kinds of molecules. Your diatomic means it's made up of two different things, and or two different atoms, and those molecules can have um, two atoms that are the same or two atoms that are different. If they are the same, they're homonuclear. If they're different, they're heteronuclear. Or you can have polyatomic molecules, and we have some examples here. So the homonuclear diatomic is something like hydrogen, two of the same kind of atom. The heteronuclear diatomic would be like carbon monoxide, and a polyatomic molecule that's shown on the very right would be methane, which is, the natural gas in your stove, if you're lucky enough to have a natural gas stove. So it's got a carbon in the middle with four hydrogens around it. So that's a polyatomic molecule. All right, so there's different kinds of formulas, of molecular formulas. So a chemical formula tells you about the composition. Molecular formula shows you how those atoms are connected, and a structural formula tells you about the general arrangement of the atoms. And here's some examples. So H2O is a chemical formula. You know that water has two hydrogens and one oxygen. In the molecular formula, it is actually utilizing either the Lewis dots or just a straight line for the bond, meaning that the hydrogens are on either side of the oxygen. But a structural formula shows that water, it does have two bonds, but it's sort of V-shaped, and the bottom one is what we call space filling, because we know those electrons are not sitting in a straight line like two sticks, and instead they're these fuzzy areas of probability. All right, the other thing you should know as far as definitions is that some elements have two or more distinct forms, and these are called allotropes. And the example given here is oxygen and ozone. Oxygen is two oxygen atoms together, whereas ozone is three. And so those are allotropes of oxygen because they are naturally occurring forms of the oxygen element. All right, so here's an example. Write the molecular formula of ethanol based on this ball and stick model. So this is a structural formula. And to do this, we say, well, there are two carbon atoms, they're the black ones. So we're going to use a carbon with a subscript of 2. There are 6 hydrogen atoms, they're the white balls here, and so we put a subscript of 6 after the hydrogen, and there is just one oxygen, which is red, and so you don't put a subscript on oxygen just by writing it, there's one of them there. So the formula is C2H6O. There is a little something you can think about here, and that is sometimes these formulas are written so that you can see kind of the active portion. So ethanol is an alcohol which has a hydroxyl unit, and so sometimes the formula would be written that way. Another important kind of formula is the empirical formula, and this is not the formula that tells you exactly how many of each atom you have, but it gives you the whole number ratio. It's the simplest formula. So for instance, if you have hydrazine, which is 8N2H4, the molecular formula is N2H4. There are 2 nitrogens, 4 hydrogens, but the empirical formula is the lowest denominator, if you will, so that would just be NH2. And you have to remember that sometimes the molecular and empirical formulas are the same. They can be the same. So here's some examples. Molecular formula for water is H2O. The empirical formula is the same. But if you're looking at hydrogen peroxide, which is H2O2, The empirical formula is just HO, and you can read through the rest of those. All right, so here's an example, right? The empirical formulas for the following molecules. If you look at glucose, C6H12O6, you pick up the sort of the largest common denominator, the least common denominator. They're all multiples of 6. And so you'd have CH2O, adenine, they're all 5s. And nitrous oxide is N2O. So your answers, in this case, for nitrous oxide, the empirical formula is the same as molecular formula because there is no common denominator. And that's it on empirical formulas.